Aloha, everyone. I'm Nicole Fortes, Marketing and Communications Director at Pacific Telecommunications Council. Welcome to PTC's webinar series, Frictionless Business. Today is our second session, Network Evolution in the 2020s. But before we get started, we wanted to share with you a brief overview of frictionless business.
PTC's new webinar series is all about frictionless business. Think of business friction as anything that can prevent a potential customer from selecting and buying your product or service. Frictionless business is about removing obstacles to success. That starts with ways to discover what problems your customers may have and how you can solve those problems for them. Create the right solutions, sell and market effectively, learn what new products you can develop, and provide your customer with outstanding support so the experience is seamless and business frictionless. It includes developing your human, technology, supply chain, and financial systems, corporate governance, market surveillance, and compliance operations. Frictionless businesses achieve superior results with less resource intensity. New thoughts, best practices, and experiences from global executives. Tap into the growth of frictionless business.
Great overview there that we have. At this time, we are going to have our moderator, Joe Weinman. He's going to come on in a few minutes to get the webinar started. But before we go there, I would like to do a few housekeeping. And I'd also like to invite all of our panelists to please join us back to the webinar. And before we go there, yes, Q&A. If any of our panelists today have any questions for our panelists, attendees for our panelists, please use the Q&A chat function on the Zoom screen. In addition to that, this webinar will be available to view 24 hours after it's completed on the PTC website. So following this, you will receive an email with information on that. And with anything that PTC does, we always want to hear your feedback. So there will also be a survey that we'd like you to complete as well. So without further ado, I now turn it over to Joe Weinman.
Yeah, I would just say if any of the panelists have questions for the audience, then I suppose they would use Facebook or something like that, Messenger, to do that, right, Nadja? So welcome everybody from around the world. It's great to have you. Not so great for those of us on the East Coast, but great for everyone else, so much for that. But we have a really fantastic webinar coming up, mostly because we have 4 incredible attendees. And so maybe without further ado, if we could each do a 1-minute intro, that would be wonderful. And Campbell, I'll start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Campbell Massey. I'm the advocacy lead for North America for the GSMA. The GSMA represents more than 750 mobile operators worldwide, including more than 100 of which are located in North America region, as well as 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. So I work with our global advocacy team as well as North American members and regulators to promote connectivity.
Great. Dave?
Excuse me. Wow. I'm Dave Temkin, VP of Network and Systems Infrastructure at Netflix. Been there for like 12 years now. Responsible for everything to do with basically any of our on or near prem network and systems and storage around the world, both for studio and for content delivery.
Nadja?
Hi, everybody. This is Nadja Muhammad. I'm part of the network infrastructure team at Facebook. So the teams I support worry about all aspects of network, from data centers to backbone to delivery of bits to end users across the world. And we are also working on a bunch of initiatives to drive broadband infrastructure and broadband penetration in all parts of the world as well.
Great. And Chris, Digital Realty supports all of this anyway, so you can finish things off.
Absolutely appreciate it. Yeah, Chris Sharp, CTO, Digital Realty. We have all types of data centers from hyperscale scale down to colo that's all heavily interconnected, and appreciate the time today.
Great. So just in case it isn't clear, one of the coolest things about this panel is the fact that we have not only two customers of network services and co-location and so forth, but the two perhaps largest customers in terms of various metrics like bandwidth and global users and so forth. So that's great. And then we have a company that provides all the interconnection that makes it happen. And as the world has gone increasingly mobile, or so I hear, I still think it's a fad. We've got GSMA representing what's going on with current traffic patterns, as well as where things are headed with 5G and beyond. So I'm going to just quickly run through some slides because that's what I do, not because it's necessarily of any value. But the key thing is that we all know that the world is undergoing massive digitalization, software is eating the world, et cetera, et cetera. And that in turn means massive growth in applications and services and network traffic. And of course, from a business perspective, what's going on, am I sharing this, by the way? I guess that might be helpful.
Not yet.
Okay. Minor little snafu there. I'm just so eager to go through these slides. So business executives basically in every industry are undergoing disruption. I really love this chart because I see it more as an IQ test rather than a accurate representation of disruption, because I think it should be 100% in every industry. But nevertheless, we know that disruption is going on. We also see that there's many, many different computing options that are really transforming the infrastructure world from a compute network and storage perspective. So it's everything from the traditional legacy systems. We're well beyond mere public cloud, hybrid cloud, and multi-cloud as the world evolves towards the edge. So we have sort of all of those different options that's increasing the needs for dense interconnection infrastructure, and also increasing the amount of traffic that is occurring at various places, whether it's something like a Netflix CDN or all of the peer-to-peer interactions on Facebook or normal texting and conversations or what have you. Netflix is fascinating because everyone says that they're in the cloud, but actually they've done a number of interesting things to offload backbone network traffic. Their Open Connect architecture basically puts entire Netflix libraries, and Dave, by the way, I would love to have one in my house, but failing that, I understand that you're at the closest rational point. So this shows you some of their global infrastructure with Open Connect, not the networks sitting behind them, obviously, connecting all these nodes. The other interesting thing is that Netflix has been a leader in adopting microservices, very small pieces of code functionality that interact with each other, as I'm sure Facebook has as well, as most leading companies. But I happen to have this chart. And the interesting thing about this is, when you look at this, the first thing that comes to mind is all of these things need to be resident in the same exact facility. However, what's interesting is that there are emerging technologies coming out that are pushing some of these microservices to the edge. And that in turn means remote calls, and especially for things where, for example, a distributed query or something like a remote credit card validation, everything is being compartmentalized into these services, and that is also increasing the density of traffic. Campbell, I hope you're happy I put in a 5G slide, because 5G is, of course, transforming the world of mobility, and mobility has transformed the world of communications. I think even Facebook and Netflix may have some mobile clients, so we'll get into that a little bit. And we also have exponential device growth. You've all seen this kind of exponential chart showing increasing amounts of IoT through, smart light bulbs and smart outlets and smart doorbells and video cameras and so forth. I did a post for PTC almost a year ago, where my estimate was that there would be 1 trillion things. And people have spoken about 10 billion or 20 billion or maybe even 50 billion things, but it's pretty easy to see how we get to 1 trillion, because even if you were to ignore all the business applications in smart cities and smart logistics and so forth, just consider home residential users, where a home residential user, if you assume there's 7 billion people in the world, and you just, you divide that by households, but then you think about every single electric outlet becoming a smart outlet, every single light bulb becoming a smart bulb, not to mention smart TVs and mobile devices and tablets and doorbells and things like that. A trillion is probably an undercount for the not too distant future. Then you've got cities that are exposing data so that people can build applications that use that data, which again is increasing the richness of the interconnection fabric. And then there's emerging technologies that we'll see. For example, one of the issues that I have with things like enhanced mobile broadband on mobile devices is my eyes aren't that good to begin with, and the form factor of my device is not that great, even though it's a Galaxy Note, so it's pretty much the largest screen you can get that will fit in your pocket. So I don't think I really need 16K on my phone per se. However, things like augmented reality and virtual reality will move those up some. When you think about also higher frame rates, perhaps some higher resolution, but then ultimately, we're not that far away from direct connections to the visual cortex, where really the bandwidth is potentially unlimited. So I think we're kind of at a point in the next few years where for many downloads, at least, we already have sufficient bandwidth, but we're going to have an increasing gap as we move. And that'll be a question to you in the future. AI, of course, requires massive amounts of data that have to come from somewhere. So that's another major mega trend that's driving network traffic. So everyone has their own view on these things. If you look at Cisco, they've been primarily looking at internet traffic growth being in the 20 to 25% CAGR. You have Equinix that has their global interconnection index that shows interconnection bandwidth growing rapidly. Dave McCrory and the team at Digital Realty just came out with a data gravity index based on Dave's work over the last decade on data gravity. And that's sort of another look at it that says, one of the drivers for interconnection bandwidth is the fact that we have this exponentially growing amount of data in many different locations, and data needs data, and that creates sort of this gravitational attraction between, for example, metros that are heavy on data. And then you've got other companies like Akamai looking at similar kinds of things, and these are just 4 that I grabbed to basically point out that that network traffic is growing in the double tens to, if you look at interconnection, more like the 40s or so types of percentages as we look at this architecture that's not just the cloud, but now moving down to the edge and through the fog. And this has dramatic implications on the global economy, where we have this virtuous cycle of increased bandwidth enabling greater knowledge intensive flows, and those have been beating out labor and capital intensive flows greatly. What I want to end with is an observation about the last 8 months. I love the movie Armageddon. I've seen it probably 15 times, and I think I've probably memorized it by now. But there's this great quote as an asteroid is about to come and hit the Earth. And this is from the president of the US, or the actor that plays him. And the point is that we're facing this immense catastrophe, but for the first time, things like the space program and weapons programs have enabled an effective defense, at least in the movies, against the asteroid. In reality, the ICT set of capabilities, you could substitute that for like every 5th word here, because think about 100 years ago, people would not have been able to deal with the Spanish flu. There was no remote learning, there was no telemedicine, there was no work from home, and yet now, thanks to our industry, we have been able to come through this. Now, interestingly, I grabbed this data. This was just published from AT&T, and it's kind of interesting because it shows a 20% growth in core network traffic. I'm not saying that's great or that it's bad. To me, I found it very surprising because I would have guessed more like a 50 or 80 or 100 or 1,000% increase in network traffic as people are no longer going around the water cooler, but instead what they're doing is, working from home, and they're doing these kinds of video conferences like we see here, or they're spending hours on Netflix as we do in my household. This I thought was interesting. It's an interesting data point because if you assume 6 months at a normal 20% growth, that accounts for 10%, and that says that COVID only increased network data traffic by 10%. I just thought that was fascinating. So let's figure out what's going on here. Those are enough slides. I think we can all agree. So let me go back to the regular screen, and I'm going to start off, Campbell, with you, if you could, because if you have any data on the use of mobile during the pandemic, especially, I'd love to hear it.
Right. So the network traffic that we saw globally increased between 20 and 100% globally. But fixed line networks shouldered a lot of that surge. Mobile did see significant increases, though, largely due to video streaming. And I was a part of that trend. Dave, love your products. It's been really great. But traffic patterns kind of changed overnight. And for all the tragic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's brought a new awareness to the power and potential of networks. Theoretically, if everyone was working from home, all of their things could just go to their local Wi-Fi. But it's really highlighted a digital divide of people that don't have Wi-Fi at home, that their cell phone is their only connection to the internet. They're working from home too now, those that can. So it's really highlighted just the changes that we're seeing. So yes, operators are investing in additional network capacity in those residential areas, building upon 4G and fiber. And you saw the government's temporary leasing spectrum to help meet those capacity needs. According to CTIA, the US alone saw an average of 24.3 increase in voice traffic and nearly 20% increase in mobile data. So that makes sense with the AT&T slide that you showed.
So they're not meeting at the water cooler anymore. They're talking on phones, which makes sense, or doing video. Dave and Nadja, either of you jump in, but what are you seeing as far as your traffic patterns? I know normally Netflix was responsible for like 40% or 50% of primetime local traffic, but what have you seen in terms of growth and or issues?
I guess I can start. So we've definitely seen growth. We ended up having to deploy a decent chunk of capacity that we had planned on deploying in 2021. We pulled it in and were able to deploy it this year. Luckily, when this all started, we were kind of knee deep already in our planning cycle for 2021. So we kind of had an idea of where the pieces needed to go. In general, though, we didn't see any major problems, literally anywhere around the world for the most part. Most of the moves that you saw, Netflix reducing bit rates, things like that, were done proactively on request from other networks, not because we felt that either our infrastructure was at risk or that we saw any egregious signs of network congestion. We saw some minor things here and there, but nothing too bad. But we definitely saw a more pronounced peak across the day, where it started a lot earlier and continued through the day, especially much earlier on. I think now it's I don't want to say it's back to normal, but it is a lot closer to what it used to be.
So would it be safe to say basically you've been growing exponentially all over the world anyway, and so some more exponential growth is just typical day at work?
We've got an awesome team that can handle that kind of stuff, which is to say that we saw a decent chunk of growth. You saw that in our quarterly results last quarter. We're continuing to grow as a company. we're continuing to see an increase in traffic, but the patterns just, I think, have changed based on the fact that people are back to school, whether it's virtual or at home. You know, when this all first started, I think schools just shut down. There was no virtual school. So I think
Can you tell whether or not my 12-year-old is watching Netflix or doing her homework?
I'll take that offline.
Okay, fair enough. All right, Nadja, what's going on with Facebook?
I think we saw very similar trends. You know, Facebook and Facebook services tend to be more of a communications platform, both one-on-one and broadcast type stuff. So we saw pretty heavy spikes in March, April timeframe when certain countries were struggling with COVID. We clearly saw those spikes on our usage. By April, May timeframe, we have blown past our 2020 forecasts for capacity and utilization. So we augmented a ton of capacity in the first few months of COVID to catch up with the peaks that we were seeing. I think things have settled down a bunch. It's still higher than where we were pre-COVID, but it's not crazy amounts of spike. So we're still ahead of forecast, and depends on sort of which region and what region is seeing what kind of problems is where we see the spikes.
So Chris, if I can ask you, because you're probably, you know, you can see all the trends statistically multiplexed together. What are you seeing as far as any shifts in growth in interconnection bandwidth kind of above and beyond the normal growth curve?
No, I appreciate that. I mean, it's kind of funny. You have some of the most advanced infrastructure represented on this panel between Netflix and Facebook. So they are outliers where I think they had already pre-planned capacity and already have an understanding of how to have variability in the overall supply chain of interconnection. So I think they're a bit of outliers, other than we too see very similar trends happening, right? Distribution of traffic within the metro, where the city centers are less of the traffic being generated, where it's now deeper out into the metro. So customers are picking up interconnection to achieve that. And then I think one of the other elements that
Chris, can I just interrupt you for a second, sorry, just to make sure I understand. So is what you're saying basically people are no longer in the city center generating traffic? They're basically all in the suburbs, as it were, at the, you know, their normal homes that they commute to, in effect?
Absolutely. We've definitely seen some distribution of traffic, right? Where it's not happening in the traditional type of large buildings where they have their big corporate network. There's a lot more utilization of home networks, MSOs, things like that. So there's been a shift where we've seen a lot of customers pick up on our internet exchanges where they want to directly peer to more of those elements to be able to directly deliver their infrastructure. And I think the last one I think is important is going global. We've seen a lot of people start to distribute their infrastructure and interconnection to overcome potential challenges. And so a lot of customers are pooling in that capacity requirement where they, just as Dave and both Najim had referenced, maybe something that was planned for 2021, a lot of that is starting to be pulled in to ensure that they have the appropriate timeline and can execute against a broader supply chain that's been pretty, it's been pretty balanced, but there has been some disruptions in the supply chain on infrastructure and cabling and things like that. But we've seen a lot of customers pool a lot of that demand in.
Well, you kind of teed up a question that I was going to ask you anyway, so I may as well ask it now, which is just as far as trends, because the data gravity report just came out a few days ago. I know that's not, you know, you per se, it's your team, I'm sure. And so sorry to put you on the spot, but it's a fascinating analysis. And so the question would be, what are the trends that you're seeing, both in terms of the data gravity report, but also, as you just mentioned, where people are sort of more concerned about building resilience into their infrastructure. So presumably that's a mega trend. They're, you know, looking at more work from home types of architectures, including VPNs. So that's a trend. You know, what are the big things that are of interest and or surprising, were surprising to you or are still?
No, absolutely. And I appreciate you referencing the work that Dave McCrory has done around the data gravity index. It's been 10 years in the making on essentially what it is defining a blueprint on how we're educating customers around the fact that they need to be mindful of their data, because where the data is being created, where the data is being stored, it has weight to it. So we were able to build a methodology that you can really assess how to build your infrastructure based upon where that data is being generated. Because I think it was interesting in your slide, you talked about 1 trillion kind of devices coming in. What's even further investigation with data gravity is the data behind those devices, right? Where a lot of these smart devices, the data resides on the device, the decision is made there. It doesn't need to come back to a broader platform, but we're seeing a lot of customers that don't think about their data up front, and it becomes a barrier for them to be successful. And so a lot of customers are coming in and trying to do their digital transformation and looking at different applications. And, you know, one of the things we always try to caution everybody, and believe me, Dave McQuarrie and the broader team would be very frustrated if I didn't say this, it all starts with the data. Like, slow down, think about where your data resides today, where your data needs to be tomorrow, and then how do you interconnect that efficiently? And so that data gravity index has allowed a lot of our current customers and future customers to really slow down and look at their environment and ensure that they can future-proof their demands. And I think the resiliency is a part of that, where, you know, having a single data store in the globe trying to service the rest of the world, it does not work. So being able to remove those barriers with what we've brought to market called Platform Digital, where you can replicate that infrastructure more closely to where those consumers are, is something that we constantly see time and time again. And I'm sure Dave, Nadja can both go into more detail on, they're at the forefront of that. And what we've been doing is removing the complexity so that broader enterprise customers can also achieve similar resiliency and efficiencies of delivering their data, content, whatever that workload or application may be. And then I think, you know, from a trend, you had it in your slides as well. AI is everywhere. There is not a vertical or customer segment that I don't talk to about artificial intelligence. And, you know, one of the great things about it is there's kind of 2 key things that we dig into, and we've partnered with NVIDIA, Core Scientific, and we've had a lot of success with building a AI lab, if you will, in the United Kingdom, where we have a lot of kind of forward thinking designs that people are proving in, but really we're constantly seeing the power density. You got to be mindful of how much power these AI chips take. And then more importantly, that people often overlook is the interconnectivity, right? Can you place that AI at the appropriate portion of your infrastructure to be able to do analytics against that data? And so that's something that I think is a trend that there's not an enterprise or a customer base that we have out there that don't want to utilize AI to get the benefit of it. But a lot of people are having that infrastructure barrier. And I think, you know, the pandemic has created a bit of a hurdle for a lot of customers to achieve that architecture. And that's where we constantly are working with everybody to make sure that we have the right supply chain and capacity provision so they can achieve that.
So I should probably be looking this up rather than quoting it from memory, but speaking of trillion connections, I think the human brain has something like 80 or 90 trillion connections. So it just gives you a sense of, if that's what it takes basically for one AI or one non-AI system to work, it gives you a sense of how much room there is for growth. Okay. So if I can go back maybe in reverse order, since Chris, you teed this up, is for Nadja and Dave, since it was Dave and Nadja before, to address maybe some of the trends that you're either seeing or surprises in what you're seeing, or things that you're sort of thinking about for the future as the infrastructure evolves, like any major shifts that you can share with all of us.
Sure. From a surprise perspective, to be honest, I think for me, the bigger surprise has been that the internet actually held up as well as it did with COVID. So congrats to all of the folks that work on the internet infrastructure. We kept the world economy going. The world would have crashed if the internet couldn't hold up.
Yeah, Virginia voter registration, not so much, but the internet worked great.
Yeah, that's more political than infrastructure in that realm. So that's honestly been the surprise element, that we could actually do these many video calls and everybody working from home. And the other somewhat surprising part was that the teams have been really productive. People have figured out ways to deal with it. Yes, people are tired and burnt out, but for the most part, productivity has been actually pretty awesome. And you have to do a little bit more to support the teams and to make sure that they're not sort of isolated and feeling really bad and just diving into work all day long. So those things have been the real positive. But I think the fundamental thing that I think has changed is that network is no longer a best effort service. So if you look at the internet, like it grew up in the best effort world. Most of the technology was built from a best effort type environment. And that's not the case anymore. And how do you build services that are 100% reliable and what do you do in that space? And that's actually a much harder problem than it seems on the surface. Even in the backbone space, interconnecting data centers and connecting to the users all around the world, we've been using, several different architectures that are still very primary, secondary type model. Those things don't scale anymore. So we've been investing in things like more planar architectures where our backbone at this point has 10 different planes. 8 of them carry production traffic. 2 of them are there for migrations and testing and canary testing and things of that nature. So there's lots of active effort going on in improving the overall reliability of the network. But that also means that you need lots of parallel paths, more fiber paths, more submarine cable systems, better hardware, better monitoring, more instrumentation, gathering data, being able to detect failures. So there's a lot of investment that's going on from a technology perspective and just pure infrastructure. We've had to roll up our sleeves and say, okay, we're going to go build fiber paths. So we're actually digging ground and putting fiber in, which we didn't think we would have to do.
So Dave, before you answer the same question, I just want to remind people that they can submit questions, and there's an arcane process that will be developed during the call to figure out how we're going to deal with those questions, but feel free to submit them anyway. So Dave, does that match what you're seeing, or are you worried about different things?
And for picking questions, you could like go the magic 8-ball route or something like that. That seems like the most fair option.
Okay.
We're certainly seeing similar stuff. Obviously, not obviously, but Nadja's infrastructure is quite different from ours in that they operate their full stack within their own data centers globally. We have, to your point much earlier, a hybrid architecture between AWS and our content delivery network. But what really, I think, I'm not going to repeat the stuff that Nadja said because it's very similar challenges. The cool thing from my side, especially, every year, Joe, you and I talk about the challenges of delivering content on the internet, and we come up with some fun angle to talk about it from. But really what has been more challenging for me and my team over the past few months has been making that content and getting that, from basically, all the way, and I'm sure you've seen news articles and stuff like that about making content in the age of COVID and what that means for the actual physical production and, the idea of having basically people producing content in bubbles. But we have artists working at home. We have visual effects folks working at home. We have animators working at home. We have people who do post working at home. None of the systems were ever designed for anything like that. And, very early on, people literally went to the office one by one and brought home these giant artist workstations with them, with the hope that we could figure out how to get them the data that they were working on, but, versus coming across the office network. But that in and of itself created this huge amount of data that we had to figure out how to get, potentially from places across the world to home broadband consumers. And we're talking about like raw 4K, 8K video. I think you and I actually talked about 8K last January and how that, still not really a thing, but it is absolutely used in content production. And so we've been rapidly iterating on what that looks like. One of my teams handles the infrastructure for that. And we've been deploying basically remote workstations that artists can work on within certain latency bounds, so that they need to be in, for example, the LA Metro within 7 or 10 milliseconds, where they can edit 4K video remotely. And when I think of like remote desktop, I think of like using Citrix 20 years ago or 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, and what a horrible experience that was. And I could never possibly imagine editing 4K video over an experience like that. And it turns out, no, the technology is there now and we actually can do that. So, you know, we've been very rapidly rolling that type of stuff out and creating ways to get content from those locations through the work that people need to do on it manually, and then back, get it transcoded and on the service.
So, I mean, there is a logic to it though, right? I mean, with the subject to latency constraints, that it's easier to bring the presentation layer to the desktop than to bring all of these terabytes of data.
100%. And so, you know, within, to your point, within latency constraints, at the end of the day, most of these people, oh, that's great. Most of these people
and power constraints.
Power constraints. Most of these people are near where our offices were. So, you know, they were all working. There was really no concept of working from home for this stuff before. So they all had to live within an LA or New York or wherever's traffic commute to get to the office, which luckily is, you know, within 7 or 10 milliseconds of most data centers where we would co-locate this kind of equipment.
Yeah, that makes sense. But also, just to follow up on that, aren't you seeing that as this technology evolves, again, always with the footnote subject to latency constraints, that you can actually have a global network of post-production and creatives and, you know, colorists and whatever doing their
100%. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens, you know, when we get back to normal, whatever normal ends up being, what we've, you know, invented or put into use here, what we can then apply to just day-to-day production and dissemination of content.
So Campbell, just to go back to what Najm said, you know, he was concerned about reliability, and Chris had sort of alluded to that earlier too. 5G supposedly is 5 nines of reliability. So I'm curious, maybe your perspective on where things stand. You know, there's a global audience. So China obviously has a major 5G program that's part of the 13th five-year plan. They've been working on it for 10 years. And they're supposedly on track to have 1 billion 5G devices by 2025. And so the question would be, where do various places in the globe stand? I mean, particularly say Asia and Europe and the US, and what is going to happen in terms of reliability, because of course it's that, not that last mile anymore, but it's now the last 1,000 feet perhaps with ultra wideband. So, so can you just say a few words about where things stand and how you'll help with reliability?
Of course. And to Najm's point, I don't want to say that we were surprised that the networks were so resilient, because we've been building them to be resilient. And we were really impressed by how globally they held up, you know, only some minor localized performance degradation in some countries. And on the topic of trends that we're seeing, you know, there's kind of some macro trends that maybe don't go away or shift us in the market a little bit. People are going to be continue working from home after this, whenever after this is. The CEO of Doctor on Demand said something interesting the other day, that the pandemic had sped up telehealth's acceptance in the market by 5 to 10 years. So those are sort of things that are interesting and will need to, you know, will be interesting to see after this. In terms of network transformation, the pandemic was not well timed. I just want to be very clear about that. But in the wider scope of network transformation, people were turning to 5G. They were starting to do that. So there was excess capacity being built in at the same time. And then you also have today, or I'm sorry, I guess it was yesterday, Apple announced the new 5G iPhone for the US. And it has millimeter wave in it. You know, other countries won't, but the US will, because we are turning on millimeter wave here and across Asia as well.
Yeah, especially like South Korea, right, and Japan are big in millimeter wave. So yes, that's all fascinating. So I do have some questions, and I am almost scared to ask them because of potential lawsuits, but I'm going to anyway. So for Nadja and Dave, as perhaps the biggest or among the biggest customers on the planet, what is it that drives you crazy about network service providers and or co-location and interconnection providers? Are they all doing a perfect job, or given that there's probably a lot of them on this webinar, you know, what would you say you wish they would do better over the next decade?
Dave, do you want to take that first, or you want me to?
I'll give each of you 1 hour. That's it.
Okay, fine. So I think the colo providers have, for the most part, have figured out how to work with the sort of larger customer like Facebook, Google, Netflix, and others. It still feels very transactional at times. At our scale, we are looking for more of a strategic relationship or strategic partnership where we shouldn't have to go get a quote for every little thing and involve a salesperson or an account manager or something like that. We want to be able to go turn up capacity very, very rapidly. So it still feels a lot more transactional, dealing with a lot of different players. But at the same time, we're very global as well. I mean, at this point, we're present in, what, 191 countries. I'm sure Netflix is getting there too. So you get all sorts of variety. But in the larger markets, we would love to see more automation, being able to turn up capacity interconnects through APIs rather than through human beings, and not have to go through a quote process to actually get stuff done. You know, from a pricing perspective, if you charge per cross connect, that model is dead and should have been dead a long time ago. It just doesn't scale for this size.
Dave?
I mean, I tend to agree. It's the same thing. I think it's part of the reason why we're both in the same podcast is we both feel a lot of the same issues. You know, in general, I would say that the market has actually gotten significantly better over the past few years. You know, it is a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back, though, because as we see consolidation, there's a whole other host of challenges that come with that every single time. To Najim's point, there's still not really a uniform way that we interface with most of these companies. And because of that, when they integrate, you know, you have a period of time during the integration where it's just an absolute disaster. And then once they've come together, you still have these challenges where, you know, you're used to dealing with them one way. The people who work there are used to the old way, but then, you know, the other people are selling a product the new way, perhaps. But in general, I think that we're definitely seeing folks line up to solve the kind of challenges that we've got over the next few years. And it seems like they're more proactive about that than they have been in the past. I like to say, you know, there are certain data center companies that operate themselves like a tech company, and there are certain data center companies that operate themselves like real estate companies. And the ones, and I'm not picking on one that happens to have realty in the name on this call, it's actually not purposely not naming names. But there are ones that operate one way and ones that operate the other way. And it is very obvious when you're dealing with them, the type of company you are dealing with. And that definitely lends itself to not only things as like, hey, can we automate provisioning of services and ordering and all that other stuff, versus like, no, this requires a service order that needs 3 levels of sign off that, you know, needs to be inked in blood. And so this is just 2 very, very different types of markets. And the cool thing is we're seeing them move more towards treating themselves like tech companies than real estate companies, even as some of them convert themselves to REITs, which is just obviously a tax strategy and not a business strategy.
So I guess, Chris, if you don't mind representing the entire global network service provider and co-location and data center industry, do you have a comment on kind of what you're seeing on the supply side?
No, I'll definitely echo the sentiments, right? It's really hard to, you know, own some of these internet gateways, right, that are old, steeped in, copper and manual cross connect processes and the LOA, like there was 7 layers and 7 documents had to get provisioned into that. And that's something that, I've been at digital for over 5 years now, and I've spent a lot of time on, in my career in the previous employer, just overcoming some of those challenges, right? Because I think I'll hit on Najim's point where automation and being able to give somebody an API and removing, to the video earlier, the friction in the business, where we want to equip our customers to be able to have access to our products in the way that they want to consume them. And so because of the varying degrees of infrastructure, particularly speaking about digital realty, where we own, so much different type of infrastructure through the M&A and through the growth trajectory that we've had going from scale to colo, it's not an easy journey, and we appreciate our customers going with us through that journey. But I think on the other side, to Dave's point, it's a prerequisite, right? Where that's why we came to market and really have been working towards platform digital, is that you have to be in a place to give consistency, to be able to supply that infrastructure and show that customers can future-proof their deployment, right? And that future-proof happens in space and power, so you don't go dark in a market. And that's where I take the realty aspect of digital realty as an important factor of our success. When we master plan a market and we go in there, we're going to make sure that you have space and power to be able to grow. And then the interconnection, right? Because I think one of the things, and hopefully I'm not saying too much, Najim, some of the work that we see customers such as Facebook and others, they have infinite network. Like the amount of network they're going to procure and turn up is infinite. And so being able to support that and watch how they're at the leading edge, there's not far behind a couple of enterprises that are also going to start to try to leverage that. And so we use that as a continuum in how we evolve our products and how we deliver our infrastructure to the market. So I think it's a prerequisite to really continue to remove the complexity, remove the barriers, and equip customers in a very simplistic fashion on a global platform.
So speaking of kind of to continue with this theme around intelligence, automation, APIs, standardization, simplification, et cetera, Campbell, one of the promises, maybe not necessarily exactly of 5G per se, but of some of the network upgrades that are going on in terms of network slicing and network intelligence and SDN and so forth. How much of that is real versus is sort of a vision? And, are you going to be able to, as the person that's responsible for defining everything with respect to 5G globally from every network service provider, will you be able to help support what Dave and Najim and similar customers need?
Well, I would hope so. I'll say that. But I think that some of the trends you're seeing in terms of virtualization are really interesting. We talked a little bit before the panel started about open networking, and that's a huge thing that we see people going towards that will probably bring prices down and help encourage other infrastructure providers to come into the market. So those are the sort of things that GSMA is working on right now. We have tech groups working on that as well as other virtualization work.
Well, I think earlier, I forget Najim or Dave, which one of you it was, but you were talking about that, I think Najim was you, that you were mentioning something to the effect that best efforts are no longer good enough and we need to move to something that is more guaranteed and, class of service oriented. And supposedly network slicing is intended to achieve that, right? So if someone wants a super fast download in EMBB, then what they do is, they kind of they maybe sign up for that in settings on their, Netflix or Facebook settings, and voila, they get a faster download. Whereas maybe somebody else wants a lower cost or more reliability. For example, if it's a Netflix content creation location and it's live dailies that are being sent up to the global post-production people. So I am just curious, not to put you on the spot, but again, just how real that is versus how directional that is, because I always have trouble distinguishing between the two, like in any industry.
Yeah, so the challenge with slicing is always that you have to worry about end to end. You can do slicing on the radio side, but as you hit a pop, where does that go, and does it go into other ISP networks? And you may or may not have slicing end to end. So that becomes an interesting challenge to be able to do that. And
Is
then
the issue when you cross providers, or are you saying even within a given provider, like a, let's say an AT&T wireless customer on that then connects through AT&T backbone to the AT&T location, or maybe it's AT&T coming into a digital realty location that has a Netflix Open Connect node?
Yeah, both. But that's what ends up happening is that when you traverse different parts of the network, it doesn't matter if it's the same company or different companies running networks. There's no end-to-end, or there's no equivalent slicing on the different parts of the network, and there's no ability today to come up with a signaling mechanism that you can signal through in that. And then if you layer on top of that the redundancy and reliability and multiple paths conversation, it becomes even more interesting, where you can take a user, and we often move it around on where we serve a user from based on bandwidth and based on latency. So we do a lot of measurements constantly, and we will serve a same user from different locations to try to improve their perceived performance as well. So it goes against coming up with a slice that is nailed up in a path of some sort. So it's a fairly complex and challenging problem to solve.
Yeah, especially for a dynamic mobile user that is, fairly bandwidth intensive.
Absolutely.
So I do want to do some Q&A. So I'm going to go kind of in order, and maybe whoever jumps in with a 45-second answer first will win a free month of Netflix, new subscribers only, card required. I guess that's your standard offer anyway, so I didn't give away too much. So, all right, question from Stefan Beckert is on core network traffic growth being only 20%. What about edge network traffic? Is it, basically back to this perhaps model of the world, which is local commuters, like Dave, you were mentioning? It's someone doing video editing or film editing from home, but they're really still in the same metro. Has edge bandwidth exploded kind of more along the lines that Campbell had mentioned? Anyone feel free to jump in.
I mean, we've, like I mentioned before, if we're talking about, mid or, intra-pandemic, we've certainly heard anecdotally that there's a lot more on the network than there was before. But at the same time, what we've heard is that these networks were built for it, and that in general, it hasn't really been a huge challenge. These networks are scalable, and people have been able to add bandwidth to the edges as they have needed to. We certainly haven't seen any major issues, as I mentioned before.
Okay, so a question from Jag Rao is basically, what is the impact of COVID-19 on the business? Revenue, profit, employee growth or non-growth, et cetera, compared with, when we were all at PTC in January and life was good, and there were just some rumors about some mysterious illness. So if things changed, accelerated, basically losses here but gains there, so it doesn't matter.
I would say yes, the mobile industry hasn't been immune to the economic downturn, and that we are pouring billions of dollars still into upgrading the network, and at the same time, they're not really getting roaming revenues right now because there is no international roaming and prepaid is also staying a hit. So you are seeing kind of a downturn, but also I would be remiss if I would be in trouble, I think, with my superiors if I didn't mention that 5G also has the capability of being a real winner in the economic upturn and helping that.
Got it. So Wi-Fi upload and perhaps non-paying customers are hurting, but by the same token, you've got growth and great opportunity. Anyone from a non-mobile perspective want to jump in?
Well, we're an ads-based company. We're global. So I don't know if you've seen much in terms of impact revenue wise, because usage is up, number of users, user growth is up. So things are moving along. I think business wise, we're doing okay.
Yeah, I would think people have a lot more time to spend on Facebook because they're not in their car, say, commuting into work on the 101 or, you know, whatever the GW Bridge or whatever the local jam may be.
Yeah, and communication, you know, communication is usually the primary use that a lot of people have needs for, so that continues to grow. The number of messages on the platform is growing rapidly.
So without intruding perhaps on any proprietary financial results, though, I am curious because Facebook is, of course, you know, not just Facebook, but is Instagram and is Messenger and WhatsApp. So are you seeing any maybe shifts from one end to the other where people are spending more time on Instagram because they're home and they can, you know, take more selfies, or I don't know?
I don't know if I would, you know, if there's any direct correlation to COVID or not. It's just usage pattern based on demographic and particular region. So if you look at India, and WhatsApp is really, really popular. Pretty much everybody has it. So it depends on demographics and usage and where you are. I don't know if there's a COVID correlation to it.
Okay. Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the overall impact of COVID. I mean, the data center has definitely increased in importance, and I would say it's expedited a lot of our customers' digital transformation journey, where they wanted to make sure that they got ahead of the curve, and they're just concerned about not being able to achieve the resiliency and the distribution for their infrastructure in a timely fashion. And even to Dave's point, I think what we did see is the internet was really good at what it was built to do, and a lot more customers picked up peering ports and were able to offload that traffic and accommodate, you know, different spikes within the overall internet. But it continues to grow, and I think we still see a lot of growth the rest of the year and into next year.
So as you know, Zoom is a visual medium, not just audio. So I'm going to ask with thumbs up and thumbs down. There's a question about cybersecurity, and is there sort of an increase or decrease in threats? So you can either go like this, like that, or like that, based on what you think is happening or what you're seeing. So if everyone can do that simultaneously, we'll get a good read. I can't see.
Up and different.
Looks like Najm, your thumb is horizontal. Okay, so 2 ups and 2 sideways. Okay, this is great. We can maybe answer all these questions visually. Okay, using an emotional facial expression, I'd like you to answer the next question. So a question about sustainability. So are you seeing that sustainability is a new major direction or imperative? Anyone?
Absolutely. We produced our ESG report here recently. Happy to share that with everybody, but it is a core element of how we view our business, and we continually evolve to achieve sustainability with our infrastructure.
So anyone else want to jump in?
I was going to say, for us, it's not new. It's just more, you know, the amount of power we burn and use. We want to be 100% all renewable, and that's the plan. And we're not just doing that. We're trying to be carbon negative, and we put out our plan to actually drive that. So it's more doubling down on being renewable.
Great. All right, 2 more questions if we have time for them. First one is the next one is Mike Sauer asking, have you seen anything different in terms of growth that is faster or different than you had projected?
Not in particular.
Not in particular?
Yeah.
No, because Netflix is just basically like this all over the world, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, we saw certain markets grow faster than others earlier in the pandemic, just based on where lockdown started. But in general, it's nothing, as things smoothed out, there's nothing overly unexpected.
Yeah.
So even though there may have been some acceleration, you know, the curve wasn't exactly the same, but the 2 data points.
I'm still on my thing, man.
I'm sorry. Sure, Campbell, did you want to jump in?
I was shushing over here.
Oh, that's all right. That's the classic Zoom. All right. Last question, and we're out of time anyway. So This is from Vinay. His question is, what does convergence mean to you and your respective businesses? And how do you see this convergence evolving over the next few years? Just jump in, whoever has a answer.
There's a lot of convergence. I think it's a necessary element in the market to be able to deliver, again, a very repeatable, simplistic service to the market. And also, I think to meet some of the future goals of AI and some of the 5G, some of the trends we talked about today, it's a prerequisite to remove that complexity out of the market.
Okay, well, all I can say is, again, thank you so much for joining. Hopefully the attendees from around the world enjoyed this as well. And this will be posted, I think, in 24 hours, Nicole said. So if you missed anything, then you can go back, and we've seen that there's a lot of sort of long tail viewers, not just the live viewers. So thank you for sharing all your insights with the world, basically, tonight.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of PTC, I do want to echo Joe. Thank you, Joe, for your moderation today. Thank you to all of our panelists who have joined us. Thank you to everybody who has attended today's webinar series, and we do invite you to join us for our third session taking place on November 18th, Global Finance and Investment Perspectives. Again, as Joe said, this will be available on our website sometime tomorrow, and then also look for that survey for some feedback. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.